Hello friends, how are you all doing? Welcome back to a brand new video. I'm Shaquille, and today we're diving into one of the most heartbreaking and unforgettable chapters of American history, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the Trail of Tears. This was the moment when thousands of Native Americans were forced from their homes and made to march hundreds of miles westward, a journey of suffering, loss, and survival that forever changed the destiny of a people. In the year 1830, the United States government passed one of the most controversial and devastating laws in its early history, the Indian Removal Act. This legislation, strongly supported and signed by President Andrew Jackson, gave the federal government legal authority to negotiate the relocation of Native American tribes living east of the Mississippi River to lands designated in the West, primarily in present-day Oklahoma. To Jackson and his supporters, this act was seen as a solution to what they called the Indian problem. They argued that the presence of Native Americans on valuable farmland in the Southeast, land that white settlers wanted for cotton cultivation, was an obstacle to economic growth and westward expansion. By removing tribes from their ancestral homelands, the government believed it could open vast new territories for settlement, agriculture, and development. However, behind the political language of negotiation and relocation was a much harsher reality. The act effectively stripped Native tribes of their rights to remain on lands that had been theirs for countless generations. It disregarded existing treaties that the United States had previously signed with tribes, treaties that recognized their sovereignty and promised them permanent ownership of their land. In practice, the Indian Removal Act was less about voluntary agreements and more about coercion, backed by military force and political pressure. For the tribes affected, such as the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole, the passage of the act was a devastating betrayal. These were nations with rich cultures, languages, and traditions, many of which had already begun adopting aspects of American society. Despite their efforts to coexist peacefully, they were still seen as expendable in the face of America's hunger for land. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 laid the foundation for what would later become known as the Trail of Tears, a series of forced marches marked by suffering, disease, and death. It was the starting point of a tragic chapter in American history, one where the promise of progress came at the cost of indigenous survival and dignity. The passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830 did not just mark a turning point in U.S. history, it marked a deep betrayal of trust. For decades before this law, the United States had entered into numerous treaties with Native American nations. These treaties recognized tribes as sovereign entities, promising them permanent rights to their ancestral lands in exchange for peace, trade, or territory elsewhere. Yet, when economic interests and the hunger for land grew stronger, those solemn agreements were simply cast aside. The Cherokee, for example, had signed treaties with the U.S. government guaranteeing their lands in Georgia. They had adopted many aspects of American life, written laws, farming techniques, schools, and even their own constitution. Despite this, the discovery of gold in Cherokee territory and the expansion of cotton farming made their land far too valuable for the state of Georgia and land-hungry settlers to ignore. Instead of honoring the treaties, state and federal authorities pushed for their removal. This wasn't just about broken legal promises, it was about broken moral promises as well. Native Americans had been assured that if they adapted and lived in harmony with the United States, they would be respected. But in reality, the more they adapted, the more threatening they seemed to expansionist ambitions. The very success of tribes like the Cherokee became a reason for their removal. The federal government justified these violations by portraying removal as an act of mercy, claiming that Native Americans would be better off in the West, away from conflict with settlers. But this narrative was deeply dishonest. What lay behind it was the greed of plantation owners, speculators, and politicians who wanted the fertile lands of the Southeast for themselves. The Indian Removal Act thus became a symbol of America's willingness to sacrifice its own word, its own treaties, and its own ideals of justice in the pursuit of wealth and expansion. The promises made to Native nations were not only broken, they were shattered, leaving behind a legacy of mistrust and pain that still echoes today. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 did not go unchallenged. Native American nations, especially the Cherokee, resisted removal with remarkable courage, intelligence, and persistence. They understood that their very survival as a people depended on defending their ancestral homelands, and they chose to fight not only with diplomacy, but also through the American legal system itself. The Cherokee Nation, under the leadership of figures like Chief John Ross, argued that they were a sovereign nation with recognized treaties and that Georgia's attempts to seize their land were unlawful. Their resistance culminated in one of the most important legal battles in early American history. Worcester versus Georgia, 1832. In this landmark case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee. Chief Justice John Marshall declared that Native American nations were distinct political communities with their own rights, and that the state of Georgia had no authority to impose its laws on them. For a brief moment, it seemed that justice might prevail. The ruling confirmed the sovereignty of native tribes and appeared to protect their land from seizure. But what followed revealed the harsh reality of American politics at the time. President Andrew Jackson, a staunch advocate of removal, reportedly dismissed the court's decision, saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Whether or not he spoke those exact words, his actions made clear that he would not honor the ruling. The executive branch ignored the Supreme Court, and the federal government pressed ahead with removal. Other tribes also resisted in their own ways. The Seminole in Florida waged a bloody guerrilla war that lasted years, costing the U.S. Army thousands of lives. The Choctaw, Creek, and Chickasaw attempted negotiation, but most were still forced from their lands under pressure. This period exposed a tragic contradiction at the heart of America's democracy. While the Constitution promised justice and equality under the law, Native Americans were denied both. Their resistance proved their determination to defend their rights, but the government's refusal to honor the courts or treaties made clear that removal would be carried out, no matter the cost. When resistance failed and the federal government pressed forward, the Indian Removal Act turned into a tragic reality. Between 1831 and the late 1840s, tens of thousands of Native Americans from the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations were uprooted. They were forced to march hundreds of miles westward to so-called Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. This brutal journey is remembered in history as the Trail of Tears. The marches were anything but orderly resettlements. Families were given little time to gather their belongings. Soldiers arrived at their homes, forcing them out with guns and bayonets. Many were held in crowded stockades, open-air camps with poor conditions, before beginning the long trek west. The government promised them supplies, food, and protection for the journey, but in practice these promises were rarely fulfilled. The distances were staggering. Entire nations traveled on foot for up to 1,000 miles, through forests, swamps, rivers, and mountains. They endured scorching summers, freezing winters, and torrential rains. Without proper clothing, food, or shelter, they faced unimaginable hardships. Disease spread quickly in the camps and along the trail. Cholera, dysentery, and pneumonia claimed countless lives. The suffering was immense. Children cried of hunger, elders collapsed from exhaustion, and families buried their loved ones along the roadside. The Cherokee alone lost an estimated 4,000 people during their forced removal in 1838-1839. Across all the tribes combined, tens of thousands perished. The Trail of Tears was not just a physical journey, it was a cultural and spiritual tragedy. As they marched, Native peoples were leaving behind sacred lands, burial grounds of ancestors, and the heart of their traditions. The land that had defined their identity for generations was stripped away, and the journey west represented not only displacement but also the erosion of heritage. The Trail of Tears became a lasting symbol of the devastating cost of greed and expansion. What was celebrated by some Americans as progress came at the price of death, suffering, and the near destruction of entire nations. At the heart of the Trail of Tears lies a story of unimaginable human suffering. The forced marches westward were not simply relocations, they were humanitarian disasters. The United States government had promised that Native Americans would be provided with food, medical care, and transportation, but in reality, these promises were left largely unfulfilled. The result was widespread hunger, sickness, and death. Entire families were torn from their homes with little warning, given only minutes to gather what they could carry. Many left behind tools, blankets, livestock, and even cherished heirlooms. Once on the march, the conditions were brutal. With only the clothes on their backs, they walked through rain, mud, and snow. Many had no shoes, and their feet became bloodied and raw on the long journey. Disease became an ever-present enemy. In crowded camps and along the trail, illnesses like cholera, dysentery, whooping cough, and pneumonia spread quickly. Without proper medical supplies, even treatable conditions became deadly. The young and the elderly were the most vulnerable. Thousands of children and elders perished before reaching Indian Territory. Starvation was another cruel reality. Food rations were often spoiled, insufficient, or never delivered at all. Families tried to survive on roots, berries, and whatever small game they could find along the way. Many collapsed from hunger and exhaustion, unable to take another step. Mothers buried infants along the roadside. Fathers carried dying children in their arms, and elders whispered final prayers as they fell behind. The emotional toll was equally devastating. Native Americans were not only losing their lives, but also their sense of belonging, their sacred homelands, and their community bonds. Each step westward carried them further from the graves of their ancestors, their sacred rivers, and the mountains and valleys that had shaped their identity. Historians estimate that about 16,000 Cherokee were forced to move, with 4,000 dying along the way. When combined with losses from other tribes, the total number of deaths reached into the tens of thousands. Each life lost was a story cut short, a culture diminished, and a future stolen. The Trail of Tears was not just a physical relocation. It was a human catastrophe, a tragedy that revealed the terrible cost of injustice and greed. The Trail of Tears did not end when the survivors reached Indian Territory. Instead, it marked the beginning of a long-lasting legacy of injustice that continues to echo through American history. For Native peoples, the removal shattered communities, destroyed cultural continuity, and left scars that would last for generations. For the United States, it revealed a painful contradiction between its ideals of liberty and justice and the reality of how it treated indigenous nations. In the decades that followed, life in the designated Indian Territory was far from the safe haven the government had promised. The land was unfamiliar, less fertile, and often unsuitable for sustaining large populations. Tribes who had once thrived on their ancestral homelands now struggled with poverty, disease, and cultural dislocation. The trauma of displacement disrupted their traditions, spiritual practices, and governance systems. Worse still, the removal did not secure permanent safety. As westward expansion continued, even the territories promised to Native Americans were encroached upon once again. The same cycle of broken promises, forced treaties, and displacement repeated itself across the 19th century, leading to further wars, relocations, and loss of land. The Trail of Tears also left a deep stain on the legacy of American leadership. President Andrew Jackson, often celebrated as a champion of the common man, is remembered by many as the architect of this tragedy. His policies showed that the rights of indigenous peoples could be sacrificed for political gain and economic expansion. This double standard undermined the very principles of equality and justice that the United States claimed to uphold. Today, the Trail of Tears stands as a symbol of resilience as well as suffering. Despite immense loss, Native nations endured. They rebuilt communities, preserved languages, and kept their cultural identities alive against all odds. The story of removal serves as a reminder of the consequences of injustice and the responsibility of future generations to learn from history. The legacy of the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears is not only about the past, it is about how a nation chooses to remember, to honor those who suffered, and to ensure such injustices are never repeated. And that's the story of the Trail of Tears, a tragic journey where broken promises, greed and injustice brought unimaginable suffering, but where the strength and resilience of native nations still shone through. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more moving and meaningful stories from America's past. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.